Today we will discuss interpretation of contracts. Before anything else, just a disclaimer. The individual behind this YouTube channel is a law student. This is not an attempt to present himself as an expert in the field, but merely an effort to share his knowledge of statutory construction based on what he learns and understands in his study of law. This lecture is merely a supplement to your study of this subject. It does not seek to replace your reading materials or contradict what your professors have discussed with you. Of all the topics in the book, to my view, this topic is the easiest. Why? Because at this point, we have codal provisions from the Civil Code. Unlike in the previous chapters where we relied heavily on books and cases, this time we have codal provisions. So, allow me to share this tip. As early as first year, it is very important to develop a habit of reading your codal provisions. Why? Because I am not lying if I tell you that codal is king. Yes, I know it's very exhausting to force yourself to read codal provisions. They are too boring to read. But once you understand the idea of every provision, once you know how to apply them in real life situations, you will definitely thank yourself later. So, it takes time to develop this habit. It does not happen overnight. It takes discipline, determination, and courage to trust on what you are doing. So let's begin. In this chapter, we will discuss interpretation of contracts. Necessarily, we will touch upon some topics from obligations and contracts. These topics necessitates extensive discussion once you reach obligations and contracts during the second semester. But for the purpose of statutory construction, we will just discuss the general concepts. What is a contract? Under Article 1305 of the new Civil Code, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. The keyword there is the meeting of minds. Sabi dyan, contract is a meeting of minds. How do we understand this? We have to read this provision together with Article 1315 of the Civil Code. When is a contract perfected? Article 1315 of the Civil Code. Contracts are perfected by mere consent, and from that moment the parties are bound not only to the fulfillment of what has been expressly stipulated, but also to all the consequences which, according to their nature, may be in keeping with good faith, usage, and law. What is the meeting of minds? Literal ba na dalawang utak ang tatanggalin sa ulo ng mga tao para mag-meet? No. Meeting of minds means both parties consented. In other words, there is a contract perfected the moment both parties agreed to the terms. Is it necessary to have a document? Kasi 'di ba, commonly when we hear contract, we imagine a document containing the terms as well as the signatures of the parties. Is that what is enunciated in the civil code? No, because legally speaking, it is not actually required to have a contract in writing. Why? Because if we read Article 1305 together with Article 1315, contracts are perfected by mere consent. So long as nag-agree ako na bayaran ko yung utang ko na nagkakahalagang 1,000 pesos at the end of the month, when that debt becomes due and demandable, I cannot interpose a defense that there was no document. Okay? Because in the first place, there was already a contract the moment both of us agreed. What are the elements of a contract? Under Article 1318, there is no contract unless the following requisites concur: consent of the contracting parties, object certain, which is the subject matter of the contract, cause of the obligation, which is established. When you are asked to enumerate what are the elements of a contract, this is the answer. Always keep in mind COC. So when we say elements, in the absence of any of the essential elements, the contract will be void. So this is like a checklist, so to speak. So when you are asked during the exam, is there a valid contract? You have to understand the problem and determine whether the three elements are present. Now, what is consent? Under Article 1319, consent is manifested by the meeting of the offer and the acceptance upon the thing and the costs which are to constitute the contract. The offer must be certain and the acceptance absolute. A qualified acceptance constitutes a counteroffer. So tahiin natin itong dalawang provisions na to, Article 1318 and Article 1319. Keep in mind, when we say consent, the acceptance should be complete, definite, and there should be an intention on the part of the person who offered to be bound. So, for example, you saw an advertisement in a television that a person is selling a house and lot. That advertisement, let's say, it provides a lot of details as to who should be contacted, where is the property located, the size, as well as the price. Now, question. If you express your intention in that house and lot through phone call, will it perfect a contract of sale? The answer is no. Why? Una, who is the offerer here? The offerer here is the person who is selling the house and lot. Now, who is the offeree? Ikaw na interesado sa bahay. Now, is there an intention on the part of the offerer to be bound? The answer is yes, because in the first place, he would not have advertised his house if he has no intention of selling it. But once you express your interest through phone call, that would not be definite and complete. Why? As a buyer, you still need to see the house, is it not? You still need to talk about the legalities, the titles, among others. So here, that's how we determine whether there is already a consent. That's the first element. What about the object, the second element? This is also known as the subject matter of the contract. Here, the subject matter of the contract is the house and lot. In other words, it is a thing capable of being appropriated. So for example, Juan de la Cruz is selling Mount Mayon. Is that valid? The answer is no, because Mount Mayon cannot be appropriated. It should also be noted that the requirement here is that it should not be outside of the commerce of man. Okay? What about the cause? I am pertaining to the third element. It is the very reason why you bought the house. Now, does this mean that every time you sell something, you should ask the buyer saan niya gagamitin yung property? Let's say you are selling house and lot. Should you ask the buyer saan niya gagamitin yung bahay? What if the buyer will tell you that he will use it as a marijuana factory? Will that illegality affect the contract? The answer is no, because the contract is entirely different from motive. Okay? The cause is entirely different from the motive. In that case, the desire to make a marijuana factory is the motive. What is the cause? The cause is that the offerer promises to transfer ownership of the house and lot. Bibilhin ko yung bahay mo kasi gusto kong mapasakin yung bahay mo. That's it. So you have to draw the line between cause of the contract and motive so that you will not get confused. How is acceptance communicated? Under Article 1320, an acceptance may be expressed or implied. When we say express, it may be oral or written. When we say implied, it may be by act, by silence, or sometimes by estoppel. What may be an object of a contract? Under Article 1347, all things which are not outside of the commerce of men, including future things, may be the object of a contract. All rights which are not intransmissible may also be the object of contracts. No contract may be entered into upon future inheritance except in cases expressly authorized by law. All services which are not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy may likewise be the object of a contract. So let's discuss this one by one. Let's go to the first paragraph. Things, it states there, all things which are not outside of the commerce of men. So what are the things that are outside of the commerce of men? The most common are those of public ownership. Let's say public highway, public streets. You cannot sell that, okay? What about future things? Let's say you sell cow's milk, gatas ng baka. Pero yung gatas na yun, nasa baka pa. In other words, gagatas pa lang yung baka. At the time you entered into a contract of sale, hindi pa gumagatas yung baka. Can you sell the milk? The answer is no, because that is considered future things. Now, what about intransmissible rights? We are still in the first paragraph. What about intransmissible rights? These are your political rights. Okay? An example of a political right, let's say the right to vote. You cannot sell that because that is considered intransmissible. Now, let's go to the second paragraph. What about future inheritance? From the word future inheritance, it means those are the property which have not yet passed upon the heirs at the time of the contract. Let's say the father of Juan is still alive. Now, under the law on succession, Juan, as a son, is a compulsory heir. Can Juan sell the property of his father on the ground that he has future inheritance to the same? The answer is no. Why? Because that is future inheritance. Lastly, all services which are not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. Let's say you enter into a contract to sell marijuana to Juan de la Cruz. Is that a valid contract? No, simply because the sale of marijuana is prohibited by law. To whom should a contract be binding? Are there any exceptions? Under Article 1311, contracts take effect only between the parties, their assigns, and heirs, except in case where the rights and obligations arising from the contract are not transmissible by their nature or by stipulation or by provision of law. The heir is not liable beyond the value of the property he received from the decedent. If a contract should contain some stipulation in favor of a third person, he may demand its fulfillment provided he communicated his acceptance to the obligor before its revocation. A mere incidental benefit or interest of a person is not sufficient. The contracting parties must have clearly and deliberately conferred a favor upon a third person. So, let's discuss this one by one. Actually, Article 1311 of the Civil Code is a very important provision because this provision talks about the principle of relativity of contracts. So, let's discuss the first paragraph. As a general rule, contracts take effect only between the parties, their assigns, and heirs. Let's have an example. Assume that Juan is indebted to Pedro. May utang si Juan kay Pedro. In that case, Juan and Pedro are parties to the contract. Juan as the debtor, Pedro as the creditor. To whom should Juan pay? To Pedro. Why? Because contracts take effect between the parties. Now, what if Pedro dies? In that case, Juan can pay Pedro's heirs. Why? Because contracts can take effect also to the parties' heirs. Now, what if Pedro assigns his credit to Maria? Then Juan can pay Maria. Okay? Why? Because contracts also take effect to the parties' assigns. So that's the general rule. What about the exceptions? The most simple one is the stipulation. You can see in the first paragraph, except in case where the rights and obligations arising from the contract are not transmissible by their nature or by stipulation or by provision of law. Let's start with the first, with the most simple one, the stipulation. Okay. Let's say the contract between Juan and Pedro expressly states that the obligations arising from this contract are not transmissible. So in that case, since there is a stipulation, the heirs cannot claim from Juan. Now, another exception by provision of law, or in other words, when the law provides. What is an example of this? Usufruct. Okay? The law on usufruct expressly provides that when a usufructuary dies, his rights are not transmissible to his heirs. Lastly, when they are not transmissible by their nature. Let's say Michael Jackson is bound to perform in the Philippines, but he died. Can Michael Jackson heirs be bound to perform because Michael Jackson died? The answer is no. The obligation here involves a skill which only Michael Jackson can perform. In other words, it is personal in nature. That's why it cannot be transmitted to his heirs by nature. Now, what about the second paragraph of Article 1311? Here, the parties to a contract provide stipulation in favor of a stranger. That's actually called stipulation por autrui. Let's say Pedro purchased Juan's phone for 10,000. It was agreed by Pedro and Juan that only 8,000 would be given to Juan because the 2,000 would be given to Maria, the creditor of Juan. If Maria communicates her acceptance of the stipulation to Pedro, Maria can demand its fulfillment. Let's go to interpretation of contracts. When courts are tasked with the interpretation of a contract, it is merely determining the intent of the contracting parties at the time they executed the contract, and the court is without authority to change the terms of the contract between the contracting parties. The reason why we have this topic under the subject statutory construction is because the principles we discussed in the previous chapters can be applied in the interpretation of contracts. Some might think that statutory construction is just a minor subject, but to me, it deserves more credit than that. Why? Without statutory construction, we would not have basic principles on how we should read laws and how we should read contracts. The courts cannot, in the guise of contract interpretation, extricate a party from a bad bargain that he voluntarily entered into, because that is not the job of the courts. The courts can only determine the intent of the parties. So if Juan consented to purchase the phone of Pedro for 10 million, that's up to them. The court cannot prevent Juan from entering into a contract of sale. What is the use of interpreting a contract? Should we not just apply the terms of a contract? It is true, we must apply the terms of the contract, but only when they are so clear that there is no doubt regarding the intention of the contracting parties. But in other cases, we should apply the rules of interpretation. That's very clear. That's from the book of Justice Edgardo Paras. Keep in mind, when the contract is clear and unambiguous, we apply the terms of the contract. Now, when there is doubt, we apply the rules of statutory construction. That is, to ascertain the intent of the parties. We also have to distinguish contract interpretation and contract reformation. Interpretation is the act of making intelligible what was before not understood, ambiguous, or not obvious. It is a method by which the meaning of language is ascertained. The interpretation of a contract is the determination of the meaning attached to the words written or spoken which make the contract. On the other hand, reformation is that remedy in equity by means of which a written instrument is made or construed so as to express or conform to the real intention of the parties. In granting reformation, therefore, equity is not really making a new contract for the parties, but is confirming and perpetuating the real contract between the parties which, under the technical rules of law, could not be enforced but for such reformation. As aptly observed by the Code of Commission, the rationale of the doctrine is that it would be unjust and inequitable to allow the enforcement of a written instrument which does not reflect or disclose the real meeting of the minds of the parties. Never forget that interpretation of contracts is entirely different from reformation of contracts. Okay, there is a thin line separating them. When we say interpretation of contracts, the courts ascertain the language used in the contract. Let's say the contract between A and B uses the term services. That can be very broad, correct? So how do you understand that? The contract will be ascertained by the courts so as to conform to the intent of the parties, which is A and B. The court will try to discover what A and B pertain when they use the term service. On the other hand, when we say reformation, the contract is amended or rectified. In reformation, the court is not actually making a new contract. It is only trying to express the real intention of the parties. I hope that's clear. Now, question. What is the cardinal rule applicable in a case where the terms of a contract are clear and leave no doubt upon the intention of the contracting parties? I hope at this point you already know the answer. It is a cardinal rule that if the terms of a contract are clear and leave no doubt as to the intention of the contracting parties, the literal meaning of its stipulation shall control. In the case of Philippine National Construction Corporation versus Honorable Court of Appeals, the court held that the contract between the parties is the formal expression of the parties' rights, duties, and obligations. It is the best evidence of the intention of the parties. Thus, when the terms of an agreement have been reduced to writing, it is considered as containing all the terms agreed upon, and there can be between the parties and their successors in interest no evidence of such terms other than the contents of the written agreement. It is further required that the various stipulations of a contract shall be interpreted together, attributing to the doubtful ones that which may result from all of them taken jointly. Let's have this case of Francisco J. Nicolas versus the Reparations Commission and Pablo Pastoral. In this case, the facts are as follows. In a written contract, the parties agreed that all legal actions arising out of this contract may be brought in and submitted to the jurisdiction of the proper courts in the city of Manila. May the parties sue in courts outside of Manila, as in the courts where the defendant or the plaintiff resides at the election of the plaintiff? The answer is yes. The parties may sue elsewhere. The clause in question being permissive only in view of the use of the word may. So you can just read this part, but the point really of this ruling is that the contract used the term may. We discussed in the previous chapters insofar as the rule in statutory construction when the law uses may, as opposed to using the term shall. See? That's how the principles of statutory construction apply insofar as interpretations of contract is concerned. How to judge intention? 'Di ba? We mentioned that when the contract is clear and leaves no doubt, we should not depart from the terms of the contract. However, in case when it is doubtful or ambiguous, then the courts should look into the intention of the contracting parties. Now, how to judge the intention? In order to judge the intention of the contracting parties, their contemporaneous and subsequent acts shall be principally considered. This is, of course, without prejudice to the consideration of other factors as fixed or determined by other rules of interpretation mentioned in the Civil Code and in the rules of courts. Hence, as a general rule, documents are interpreted in the precise terms in which they are expressed, but the courts, in the exercise of their sound discretion, are called upon to admit direct and simultaneous circumstantial evidence necessary for their interpretation with the purpose of making the true intention of the parties prevail. This is expressed actually under Article 1371 of the Civil Code. Later on, we will have an illustrative case for this. Now let's go to the legal provisions on the interpretation of contracts. Like I said, when you study for this subject, caudal is king. You have to learn how to understand and apply the caudal provisions because with your caudal, you will not get lost. So I hope you have your caudals with you while listening to this lecture. So let's begin. Let's read Article 1370 of the Civil Code. It states there, if the terms of a contract are clear and leave no doubt upon the intention of the contracting parties, the literal meaning of its stipulation shall control. If the words appear to be contrary to the evident intention of the parties, the latter shall prevail over the former. Contracts constitute the private law between the parties and should be fulfilled according to the literal sense of the stipulations in the contract if the terms thereof are clear and leave no doubt with respect to the intention of the contracting parties. I also invite your attention to Article 1159 of the Civil Code. That's the principle of obligatory enforce and compliance in good faith in contracts. Basically, contracts have the force of law between the contracting parties. That being said, when it is clear and unambiguous, it has to be applied. While ordinarily, the literal sense of the words employed is to be followed in the interpretation of contracts, this rule shall not apply when it appears to be contrary to the evident intention of the contracting parties, in which case the intention of the contracting parties shall prevail. So that's the exception. As a general rule, apply the provisions of the contract. As an exception, when it is ambiguous. In other words, when the contractual stipulations is in conflict with the apparent intention of the parties. In that case, the intention of the contracting parties shall prevail. Again, how do we determine or judge the intention? Based on the contemporaneous and subsequent acts of the parties. The primary and elementary rule of construction of documents is that when the words or language thereof is clear and plain or readily understandable by any ordinary reader thereof, there is absolutely no room for interpretation or construction anymore. This is like the verbalese rule that we talked about in the previous chapters. When the law is clear, there is no need for construction or interpretation. Diba? We discussed that. In fact, we said verbale his non est residendum. From the words of the statute, there should be no departure. That concept also applies in contracts. Yun nga lang, dito, contracts ang subject, not laws. The character of transactions entered into between the contracting parties was determined not by the language used in the document, but by their intention in entering into the contract. In other words, the intention is more important than the language used. Why? Simply because not everyone is aware of legal terminologies. Remember, you can enter into a contract without the assistance of a lawyer. Although it is advised that you should get one for your protection, but in most cases, people enter into contracts without the assistance of a lawyer. Therefore, it is inevitable that sometimes people commit mistakes insofar as naming their contracts. Later on, we will have an illustrative case for this. The rule is that where the language of a contract is plain and unambiguous, its meaning should be determined without reference to extrinsic facts or aids. So you can just read this portion of the slide, but we have mentioned this repeatedly already. Let's have this case of Abelia versus Gonzaga. In this case, the facts are as follows. R entered into a contract called Contract of Lease, take note of that, with E, whereby R leased his car to E. It is stipulated that E shall pay 100,000 pesos upon the signing of the contract and 5,000 pesos by way of rental on or before the fifth day of every month, and that at the end of the year, take note, E would become the absolute owner of the car. The contract fixed the value of the car to be 160,000 pesos. Take note, what was the contract called? Contract of lease, meaning the heading of the contract states contract of lease. But what was the stipulation? E would become the absolute owner. In a contract of lease kasi, you are only giving temporary use of the property. But here, E would become the absolute owner. Why is that? Which one should prevail? So how did the Supreme Court rule? There can hardly be any question that the contract is not a lease of the car but a sale in installments. The so-called rent must necessarily be regarded as payment of the price in installments inasmuch as the due payment of the agreed amount results by the terms of the bargain in the transfer of title to E, the alleged lessee. So here, the contents of the contract would prevail, no matter how the parties call the contract. If their intention is evident, then the intention should prevail. This is what I mentioned earlier, that the character of transactions entered into between the contracting parties was determined not by the language used in the document, but by their intention in entering into the contract. Now, going back to our discussion, if the language of the contract is clear, the language of the contract should be followed. Apply it, in other words, similar to verbal lehis. Now, what if there is ambiguity? We should resort to the intent of the parties. Here, was there an ambiguity? The answer is yes. That's why the court resorted to the intent of the parties. Now let's go to Article 1371. In order to judge the intention of the contracting parties, their contemporaneous and subsequent acts shall be principally considered. While the courts cannot determine with certainty the intent and state of mind of the contracting parties, their actions contemporaneous to or subsequent to the execution of the contract serve as evidence of their contractual intent at the time of its execution. The parties' practical construction of their contract has been characterized as a clue or index to or an important, significant, convincing, persuasive, or influential factor in determining the proper construction of the contract. This is what I mentioned earlier as to how the courts judge the intention of the parties. It's actually in the caudal. To better understand this, let's have an illustrative case. Let's have this case of Manila Electric Co. versus Board of Public Utility Commissioners. In this case, the facts are as follows. Under a franchise which is in the nature of a contract granted by the City of Manila for the construction and maintenance of a street railway system, employees of the police and fire departments of the city shall be entitled to ride free upon Meralco cars. For 9 years, the parties had understood the provision giving the privilege of free ride as granted only to those wearing official badges visibly during the period of transportation. Take note, for 9 years, the practice was wearing official badges visibly. In other words, for 9 straight years, the parties understood the contractual provision that way. Subsequently, the city secured an order for the Public Utility Commission, an order requiring the Meralco to give the same privilege to city detectives who did not wear their badges visibly. So at this point, it is obvious why the court has to determine the intention of the parties. Why? Because there is already a doubt as to what is the meaning of the contractual provision. Kailangan ba visibly or not? That is why the court looked into the contemporaneous and subsequent acts of the parties. So according to the Supreme Court, the construction placed by the parties to the contract on the clause under consideration must exert a powerful influence in the determination of the question presented. The construction adopted by the Commission was diametrically opposed to that which the parties have placed thereon for so long a time. So that's how the court determined the intention of the parties. The court looked into the acts of the parties. Ano ba ang naging practice nila for a long time? If the practice was to wear badges visibly, then that is the intention of the contractual provision. Let's go to Article 1372. However general the terms of a contract may be, they shall not be understood to comprehend things that are distinct and cases that are different from those upon which the parties intended to agree. A provision in a contract should not be expanded beyond what it intended to cover. That's very self-explanatory. Okay. We mentioned already earlier that the courts are only allowed to ascertain the intention of the parties. Therefore, if the courts will expand a provision beyond what is intended by the parties, that will not be allowed. As a rule, where a contract, there are general and special provisions covering the same subject matter are inconsistent, the latter shall be paramount to and control over the former when the two cannot stand together. We discussed in previous chapters that special law prevails over general law, correct? That is why, when it comes to contracts, special provisions prevail over general provisions. That is, if there is inconsistency. But if they can stand together, both provisions shall be given effect. The reason for this rule is that when the parties express themselves in reference to a particular matter, the attention is directed to that, and it must be assumed that it expresses their intent, whereas a reference to some general matter within which the particular matter may be included does not necessarily indicate that the parties had that particular matter in mind. The fact that the parties accorded a particular term a special meaning, it means they both intended to have that meaning be given effect. To better understand this, let's have an illustrative case. Let's have this case of Empire Insurance Co. versus Rufino et al. This case involves the intestate proceedings for the settlement of the estate of the late Vicente Rufino. While no claims were filed in the proceedings, the respondents, all heirs of the deceased, were aware that the decedent left obligations to third parties and caused these obligations to be attached to the partition agreement executed by them. 3 years after the proceedings were closed, Empire Insurance, whose claim is not included in the inventory, sued the respondents, citing their undertaking in the partition agreement that they will pay all outstanding obligations of the deceased. So, ano ba ang nangyari sa case na ito? Pasimplihin natin. Una, what was the contract in this case? The partition agreement executed by the heirs. Basically, when Rufino died, his heirs executed a partition agreement among themselves. Under the partition agreement, the heirs agreed that they will pay all outstanding obligations of the deceased. So, sabi ng Empire Insurance, kasali sila. Okay? Kasali sila kasi all outstanding obligations of the deceased eh. But here's the problem. That specific obligation to Empire Insurance was not included in the inventory. If you read the full text of this case, there was actually an enumeration of all the claims against the estate of Vicente Rufino. So, can Empire Insurance claim, despite the fact that it was not included in the inventory? According to the Supreme Court, Article 1372 of the Civil Code stipulates that however general the terms of a contract may be, they shall not be understood to comprehend things that are distinct and cases that are different from those which the parties intended to agree. Similarly, Article 1374 of the same code provides that the various stipulations of a contract shall be interpreted together, attributing to the doubtful ones that sense which may result from all of them taken jointly. Consequently, the phrase all liabilities or obligations of the decedent used in paragraphs 5 letter C and 7 letter D should be then restricted only to those listed in the inventory and should not be construed as to comprehend all other obligations of the decedent. So, in other words, Empire Insurance cannot claim. Why? Applying Article 1372, however general the terms of a contract may be, they shall not be understood to comprehend things that are distinct and cases that are different from those which the parties intended to agree. Here, what was the intention of the parties? The intention is to limit those obligations stated in the inventory. So that's the meaning of the word all. So, since Empire Insurance was not included in the inventory, the term all shall not be understood to include them. So that's the wisdom of this case. Let's go to Article 1373. If some stipulation of any contract should admit of several meanings, it shall be understood as bearing that import which is most adequate to render it effectual. When an agreement is susceptible of several meanings, one of which would render it effectual, it should be given that interpretation. Thus, if one interpretation makes a contract valid or effective and the other makes it illegal or meaningless, the former interpretation is one which is warranted by the rules stated in Article 1373. Does it ring a bell? Remember what we discussed in Chapter 4? There is a principle like this in statutory construction. We mentioned in Chapter 4 that a construction that would render a particular provision ineffective should be avoided. Now, when it comes to contracts, when a contractual provision is capable of two or more interpretation, that interpretation which would render that contractual provision effectual should be given effect. Why? In the first place, there would not have been any stipulation if the parties did not intend to make that stipulation effective. Well, of course, provided that the stipulation is not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. Let's go to Article 1374. The various stipulations of a contract shall be interpreted together, attributing to the doubtful ones that sense which may result from all of them taken jointly. As in statutes, the provisions of a contract should not be read in isolation from the rest of the instrument, but, on the contrary, interpreted in the light of other related provisions. It is a canon of statutory construction that the whole and every part of a statute must be considered in fixing the meaning of any of its parts and in order to produce a harmonious whole. This is the injunction in Article 1374. Again, does it ring a bell? It should be. Remember our discussion in Chapter 4. We said that laws should be construed as a whole, correct? Now, similarly, in contracts, stipulations shall be interpreted together and not in isolation. That's why in the case of De Leon versus Court of Appeals, the court explicitly stated that the principle that law should be construed as a whole has a counterpart in the Civil Code, which is Article 1374. Let's have this case of Cañete versus San Antonio Agro-Industrial Development Corporation. The court was presented apparently conflicting provisions in a lease contract. Paragraph 3 of the lease contract states that the lease shall begin in crop year 1968 to 69 up to and including crop year 1973 to 74 with an option of another 5 years on the part of the lease to extend. On the other hand, paragraph 7 of the contract states that the lease is given an option to purchase the above described parcels of land in case the lessor shall be willing and desirous to sell the same, and likewise the lessee is given the option to lease the above parcels of land in case the lessor is likewise willing to lease the same again. So, we have conflicting provisions in this case. On one hand, paragraph 3 gives the lessee a guaranteed right to extend without needing the lessor's approval. On the other hand, paragraph 7 says that a renewal or release is subject to the lessor's consent. In short, paragraph 3 creates a mandatory extension, while paragraph 7 creates a discretionary one. One clause favors the lessee's unilateral right, while the other emphasizes the lessor's choice. This inconsistency is the conflict or the meat of the controversy in this case. So, how did the Supreme Court rule? According to the Supreme Court, what is positively granted in paragraph 3 would appear negated by paragraph 7. We are not prepared to believe that parties to a contract who are sui generis and presumably knowledgeable of the purposes for which they solemnly put into writing their agreements could be so careless as to set down conflicting and inconsistent conditions in such brief and simple contracts as those now before us. Indeed, in line precisely with the proposition pursued by the trial court that pursuant to Article 1374 of the Civil Code, all the terms of a contract must be interpreted together to give effect to the whole agreement. We are convinced that the best reconciliation between paragraph 3 and paragraph 7 is to give effect to the latter only after the option in the former has already been exercised, thereby avoiding conflict, contradiction, and inconsistency within the four corners of the same agreement. So, we don't need to discuss the technicalities of this case. Okay? We will just discuss how the court ruled. So, here, while the court said that what is positively granted in paragraph 3 would appear negated by paragraph 7, the court did not render any of the paragraphs ineffective. Okay? Why? Because reading paragraph 3 and paragraph 7 together, it can actually or they can actually be reconciled. So that's why the court reconciled this these provisions that appears to be conflicting. Going back to our discussion, the stipulations in the contract should be interpreted together. Let's go to Article 1375. Words which may have different significations shall be understood in that which is most in keeping with the nature and object of the contract. Under Article 1376, the usage or custom of the place shall be borne in mind in the interpretation of the ambiguities of a contract and shall fill the omission of stipulations which are ordinarily established. So, to better understand these provisions, let's have some illustrative cases. Let's have this case of German and Co. versus Donaldson Sim and Co. In this case, A, the agent, was appointed by P, the principal, as manager of the latter's business under a power of attorney which confers authority to exact the payment of sums of money by legal means. Now issue. Does this authority include the power to exact the payment of debts due the business concerned by the institution of suits for their recovery? The answer is yes, for it cannot be reasonably supposed, in the absence of very clear language to that effect, that it was the intention of P to withhold from A power so essential to the efficient management of the business entrusted to his control as that of suing for the collection of debts. So in this case, we can see how the Supreme Court considered the nature and object of the contract. So, according to the court, since A was appointed as a manager, it would not be reasonable if A is not accorded with the power to exact payment of debts. Manager nga eh. So, said by the Supreme Court, that power is essential. Let's have this case of Northern Cement Corporation versus IAC. In this case, the basic issue is the meaning of the phrase integrated services as used in the agreement entered into by Northern Cement Corporation, the herein appellant, and Appellee Shipside Incorporated. The phrase was not defined by the parties. According to the court, we have gone over the arguments of the parties and find that the respondent court did not err in its interpretation of the phrase integrated services as used by the parties in their verbal agreement. There being no written definition of this term, it was proper to understand it in the light of the usages of the place where the contract was entered into and of the particular circumstance attending the case at bar. The meaning given is in our view consonant with such usages and circumstances, not to mention ordinary common sense. Notice the phrase that I highlighted and try to read again Article 1375 and Article 1376. At this point, I hope you are still reading these provisions. So in this case, the court considered the following. First, the place where the contract was entered into. Second, the particular circumstances attending the case at bar. This is a very clear illustration of Articles 1375 and Article 1376. Now let's discuss Article 1376. The usage or custom of the place shall be borne in mind in the interpretation of the ambiguities of a contract and shall fill the omission of stipulations which are ordinarily established. The usage or custom of the place where the contract was entered into may be received to explain what is doubtful or ambiguous in a contract on the theory that the parties entered into their contract with reference to such usage or custom. Courts take no judicial notice of custom. It is therefore necessary to prove the existence of usage or custom like any other fact according to the rules of evidence, the burden of proof being upon the party alleging it. But usage or custom is not admissible to supersede or vary the plain terms of a contract. That which is agreed upon in a contract is the law between the contracting parties, provided it is not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy. When we say that the courts cannot take judicial notice, meaning proof is necessary. In other words, if you are alleging that a custom exists in a particular place, which might be essential in the interpretation of a contractual stipulation, you should prove that such particular custom really exists in that particular place. But take note, do not forget Article 1159, the one that I mentioned earlier, that obligations arising from contracts have the force of law between the contracting parties. So, even if a contractual stipulation is not exactly the same as a custom existing in a particular place, provided that the stipulation is not contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy, the contractual stipulation should prevail over the custom. Let's discuss Article 1377. The interpretation of obscure words or stipulations in a contract shall not favor the party who caused the obscurity. The reason for the rule in Article 1377 is that the party who drafted the contract more easily than the other could have prevented mistakes or ambiguity in meaning by careful choice of words or by the exercise of a little more care, and generally, the party who causes the obscurity acts with ulterior motives. These contracts are so-called contracts of adhesion because almost all their provisions have been drafted by one party, and the only participation of the other party is the signing of his signature or his adhesion thereto on the take it or leave it basis without the right to modify it. So these are called contracts of adhesion. The most common example of this kind of contract is insurance contract, di ba? The insurance company already has a contract. All you have to do is to sign it. Now, what if the insurance company, with malicious intent, caused obscure words in order to deceive you? Later on, can the insurance company use your mistake to their advantage? The answer is no. Why? Because of Article 1377. It was them who caused the obscurity. Let's have this case of Government of the Philippines versus Derham Bros. In a contract, it was agreed that a metal roadway would be built on the street where the real property was located to its entire length. Now, the pronoun its may refer either to the street or the real property. The government contended that the whole street should be metalled, alleging that the antecedent of its was the street. Upon the other hand, the contractor said that its referred throughout the length of the real property. It was the government who drafted the contract. Take note of that. So, how did the Supreme Court rule? The contractor is correct. It was the government that caused the ambiguity, so the interpretation of its should not be in the government's favor, and therefore it may be concluded that it was not intended by the contracting parties that the whole street would be metalled. When different interpretations of a provision are otherwise equally proper, that construction is to be taken which is the most favorable to the party in whose favor the provision was made and did not cause the ambiguity. So here, like I said, it was the government who drafted the contract. Therefore, it was also the government who caused the ambiguity. Therefore, by applying Article 1377, it shall not favor the party who caused the obscurity, which is the government. Let's discuss Article 1378. When it is absolutely impossible to settle doubts by the rules established in the preceding articles, and the doubts refer to incidental circumstances of a gratuitous contract, the least transmission of rights and interests shall prevail. If the contract is onerous, the doubt shall be settled in favor of the greatest reciprocity of interests. If the doubts are cast upon the principal object of the contract in such a way that it cannot be known what may have been the intention of or will of the parties, the contract shall be null and void. When, despite the application of the preceding rules, Articles 1370 to Article 1377, certain doubts still exist, such doubts shall be resolved in accordance with the supplementary rules stated in the present article. To better understand this provision, let's have some examples. First example, R gave his car to E. It is not clear whether the contract is a donation or a comodatum. The contract should be presented as a mere comodatum because it would transmit lesser rights than a donation since R retains his ownership of the car. We said in Article 1378 that if the doubt refers to the incidental circumstances of a gratuitous contract, such interpretation should be made, which would result in the least transmission of rights and interests. In a donation kasi, you will own the thing. In comodatum, you are only granted the right to use it for a particular time. So, which one is considered least transmission of rights? It is the comodatum. That is why, in this example, we will consider the contract as comodatum and not a donation. Second example, D borrowed from C 5,000 pesos at 18% interest. It cannot be determined from the terms of the contract whether the loan is payable in 6 months or in 1 year. It must be assumed that the period agreed upon by one is 1 year, which results in greater reciprocity of interest since D can use the money for 1 year and C, on the other hand, can earn interest due for 1 year instead of only 6 months. So, if the contract in question is onerous, you may see Article 1350 for onerous contracts. So in that case, the doubts should be resolved in favor of the greatest reciprocity of interest. So in this example, dapat pantay sila. Advantageous kay D, advantageous din dapat kay C. So that's how reciprocity works. Third example, S sold his land to B. S made S has many lands. It cannot be determined which land was intended by the parties to be the subject of the sale. Therefore, the contract shall be null and void, and it is as if the parties have not entered into any contract at all. So this pertains to the last paragraph of Article 1378. If the doubt refers to the very principal object of the contract, such doubt cannot be resolved. Therefore, leaving the intention of the parties unknown, the contract shall be null and void. Let's go to the last article, Article 1379. The principles of interpretation stated in Rule 123 of the Rules of Court shall likewise be observed in the construction of contracts. So you can just read Rule 123 of the Rules of Court, but personally, I assume it will not be asked in your exams since the Rules of Court is quite technical for first year students, especially this Rule 123 falls under the subject Rules on Evidence. So, but just understand the wisdom of Article 1379 of the Civil Code. So, when you are asked, can the rules of court be resorted to in resolving doubts as to the construction of contracts? The answer is yes. But always qualify your answers that it can be applied in a suppletory manner only. Principally, it is the Civil Code still that will apply. So that would be all. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much for joining me through chapters 1 to 9 of this subject. Your support and engagement keep this journey meaningful, and I'm grateful to have you learning with me every step of the way. May your love for the law remain strong as always. Maraming salamat po.